Well, we've smashed through our short topics, Bob, so it is now time to get to our main topic. This is our roughly annual look at a Doctor Who writer, or in this case writers, and so it's time for Bob and Dave to do Bob and Dave.
Yes. I've been looking forward to this one all month, Dave.
It just seems so obvious when we put it that way.
I know, it should have been like our third episode or something.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Let's talk about sort of why we're doing this. Apart from the wonderful titular pun, there's more to it than that. When we first did one of these, we did Terry Nation because I'm a huge Terry Nation fan and I wanted to do a bit of rehabilitation of Terry Nation. The most recent one we did was Mark Gatiss because he's got a lot of stories that have very mixed opinions and there's a lot to say. And I think it's partly similar with Bob and Dave. There's a lot of stories they've contributed. 7 stories as a team, which is what we'll be looking at, noting that Bob Baker did a solo one afterwards, Nightmare of Eden, and some K9 spin-off stuff. But 7 stories across the whole of the 70s is a pretty big deal, and I don't think they get a lot of attention.
No, that's for sure. And I don't know why, because at least half of their episodes are quite good. At least half the stories are quite good. And they have written so many. In fact, I've got a statistic here in my notes that I'll get to later. It's a bit perplexing why that is. I don't actually have an answer for it.
Yeah, I mean, 7 stories is significant. They've done it across a couple of Doctors, and again, I've got some more stuff to talk about as it comes on. Plus, also, I think there is quite a bit to talk about, and like Gatiss, the perception of their work, I think, is very varied. There are people out there who I think are big fans of most or all of their work. There are people out there who sort of consign them a bit to the junkyard lock stock. And there are others who sort of would probably say, well, look, they've got some real classics there and some real stinkers there. And again, they may not be consensus over which are the good and which are the bad. So I think it's a very mixed record and a very rich sort of fan consensus. I mean, and maybe that's part of it. Everybody sort of says, oh, well, Malcolm Hulke was a fantastic writer and Robert Holmes was a classic writer and Pip and Jane Baker were terrible writers, whatever. There's a sort of a fan consensus around some. You can put them in a nice little tub.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Bob Baker and Dave Martin don't, I think, have quite that easy box to put them in. Maybe that's part of it as well.
Yeah, that is true. But at the same time, they've done enough that they should be just noticed regardless. And I don't think they're noticed as much. Yeah, quite right on that.
Yeah, and I think part of it, and we're probably moving a bit more into the discussion phase at this point, but part of it is also that every documentary that you see Terrence Dicks particularly talk about these guys on, and Barry Letts as well to a certain degree, there's always that thing of, well, the Bristol Boys, Bob Baker and Dave Martin, they were reliable. If the script came in, the first draft was pretty good, the second draft was basically ready to shoot, and so we just got on with the job. There isn't a whole lot of controversy, there weren't a lot of arguments, occasionally things like, a big part of the 3 Doctors had to be rewritten, but they again, you don't get these documentaries on the DVDs about how this writer fought with this script editor and this thing had to be done and then he took his name off it and a bland pseudonym, and you don't get those stories about them. They just turned up, delivered a script that was filmable, and everyone filmed it and went home.
Yeah. They're kind of like us, Dave, on the podcast. We don't argue, we just get on with things, churn stuff out, good and reliable, set your clocks by us putting episodes out. People have been able to do that for like 9 years now. It's actually quite spooky. We're kind of like them.
The Bob and Dave of podcasting, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so perhaps going back half a step, Rob.
Yes.
When you turned your mind to Bob Baker and Dave Martin, where did your mind go first? What were the thoughts that came in? How did they sit in your mind?
Well, I think when people talk about Bob and Dave, people in general, the first thing they seem to get called out for is for creating K9. But as I was never hugely into K9, I don't really think about that side of them, even though I know it's perfectly true. I tend to think about how prolific they were as a team, which we've just been discussing. And these are the stats that I mentioned a moment ago. In terms of classic Who writers, there's only Holmes, Nation, Hulke, and Whittaker who have written more episodes. I mean, just think of all the great classic Who writers who aren't in that list.
Yeah.
Bob and Dave outwrote them all. Yet, maybe they don't get thought of as much by the average fan as, say, Dix, Sloman, Fisher, Aronovich, who wrote less. In fact, far less in some cases. Of course, if you extend it to the modern show, RTD and Moffat slip into that top tier as well through simply being showrunners and writing a lot of stuff.
For sure.
But I tend to think of them as these guys churning out tons of stories in the 70s and doing reasonably well at it. That's my sort of gut feeling when you say their names to me.
Yeah, I had some similar thoughts. I did sort of go through the whole... I didn't quite get the stats, I'm glad you did, Rob, but I did go through the whole... Wow, they've written a lot to not really be spoken about all that much. And I did reflect on the Terrance Dicks. I was always happy to commission them because they delivered a script on time and it was sort of, ready to go. They didn't need hand-holding. But, I remind myself they weren't just commissioned by Terrance Dicks. They were commissioned by Bob Holmes, Anthony Reid, Douglas Adams. They worked with Barry Letts. They worked with Philip Hinchcliffe. They worked with Graham Williams. They were hired by a multiple production team. So clearly it wasn't just Terrance Dicks that liked them. It was, they had a reputation, I suspect, in the industry and in television as well.
Yeah, and look, when they first met with Terrance, Derek Sherwin was around at the time.
Yeah, that's true.
It took him another year of writing 1 or 2 page outlines and sort of sending them in until they got something really right that the Doctor Who team wanted to work with. But the Doctor Who team was interested in them from the days of Terrance Dicks and the later period of Derek Sherwin and all of that. So, yeah, they were kicking this stuff off when Troughton was still the Doctor. Yeah,
absolutely. So they certainly had some longevity, and you don't get that in television unless you've earned it. So people certainly thought they were doing a good job, and I think they did a good job quite a way along. I'm also very aware that I think there is a bit of a... To the extent there is a fan consensus, and I don't think it's a very large extent, it is probably now skewing a little bit negative. I know I've listened to the Flight Through Entirety guys talk about them on a regular basis during their flight, and they're pretty down on them. Todd as well, who I normally agree with Todd's opinions quite often, but he made the comment that they write 2 good episodes a season, and that's sort of condensed, which looking at it, I think is a bit unfair. But again, I think that's sort of where the conversation's been. But before we get into the general discussion, Rob, anything else?
I talk about them meeting up with Terrance and Derek Sherwin and all of that, and I was watching the Mythmakers episode with Bob and Dave, and something that comes across very plainly when they talk about, their initial contact with Who, and even getting deeper into Doctor Who, is I don't think they can believe how far they were able to push things, with their collaboration. This was still the era, Dave, where, armed with a typewriter and a bit of front, you could pretty much talk your way into doing television, or even movies if you were really lucky, but television in particular. It's like it was such a new industry, relatively, that hardly anyone understood the industry. And if you had half an idea and something of an ability to offer and ran into the right person at the right time, bingo, you've got a career. You could say the same could happen today. Someone could write something great and find the right person, but I think the chances have blown out enormously. Everyone thinks they're a talent these days and can write. And not only are there many people who delude themselves today, but I think the industry is just a lot more professional and structured these days, and different. I think the whole concept of how the BBC would make programs in the 60s and 70s particularly, and even into the 80s, is this quaint place that writers today can only dream about, I think.
I think that's right. It's something that we spoke about on our season 24 deep dive last month, that we are still, as you say, in the era of I'll just keep bashing out ideas and send them off until somebody commissions me or I give up, rather than coming through proper courses and colleges and training segments and all the rest of it. They're just, hey, I'm just going to keep writing and see what makes of it. And if they're a little bit good, someone like Terrance Dicks says, look, mate, this isn't right, but come have a drink and I'll explain to you how to do it better. And yeah, it's a very different industry they came up through.
It's quite remarkable. You're sitting there watching telly and you think, oh, I can do that. you just pull out the typewriter and start writing. It's what people did. It's nuts.
Well, it's like Sylvester telling the story at the Science of Audio event about how he was working in the cloakroom in the front office of a theatre, and he would, occasionally amuse people with a few sort of crazy jokes and antics in the bar afterwards. And somebody didn't show up for work one day, and they said, "I need an actor to quickly do something. Who have you got?" And they're like, "Oh, that guy over there in the ticket box is kind of funny. Have him." And it just goes from there.
Yeah, and with Bob and Dave, I mean, they met, as far as I'm aware. Bob was working in a little shop that sold stuff, including cigarettes, and Dave would come in. He was working at an ad agency and making loads of money, but he was quite bored with it and wanted to get out of it. And he would come in to buy his cigarettes. And that's how Bob and Dave met. You know, Bob's selling cigarettes, Dave's bored with his ad job, and they get talking, and next thing they decide to write scripts together.
That's so amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's nuts.
It is, and it's just so BBC early 70s.
Yes. It's extraordinary.
So, Rob, let's dive a bit further in. And the first big point that I've got that I want to talk about is, as I was looking at all their stories and assessing what I wanted to talk about, the word ambition came up again and again and again. I'll look at the Claws of Axos and go, wow, the ambition of this. Then I'll look at the invisible enemy and go, wow, the ambition of this. And just consistently that came out. Now, I have some thoughts about how that worked out. But if you were talking about them as writers, their willingness to just throw big, crazy concepts at the wall, I think is actually quite remarkable. And I think perhaps a bit of a hallmark of their work.
Yeah, absolutely it's a hallmark of their work. To the degree where they even have sort of shorthand for it, which I've read and seen in numerous interviews, where one of them will say, yeah, we were basically trying to write Star Wars and giving it to the BBC to do on, you know, the BBC budget. Of course, Star Wars came years after they'd started doing this, so that's not what they were trying to do in the first place. But as an analogy for what they were trying to do, I think it's quite right. They're trying to write this big stuff. Might not necessarily be space opera like Star Wars, but big ideas and just stuff that the BBC couldn't do. And I think that's where some of the stories, and I'm sure we'll talk about some individually later, I think that's where some of the stories fail, and I don't think that's really on them, because I don't think writers should be criticised for having big ideas. There might be a counter to that, maybe writers should try and write to what the BBC can do, rather than just having big ideas in general. But, I don't know, I like that they have big ideas, Dave. I think that's perfectly true, and I agree.
I think this is worth teasing out, because I get where you're coming from, and in many ways I'm sympathetic to it. I noted down here that when we talk about their big ideas and their ambition, it goes beyond the ideas and it goes to just how they tell their stories. Now, I was interested to note that 4 of their 7 stories occur across multiple planets. You know, they're going from Titan to the Baal Foundation, or they're going from Earth to the Black Hole, or Atros to Zeos to the Shadow Planet. You know, they're literally big scale in terms of their geography as well as their ideas. But I'm so conflicted here, Rob, because I do agree with what you're saying. Like, a writer should go out there and write a big story, write the most imaginative story he or she can write, and then it's up to the production team to make it work. But I also look down this list of stories and just go, Claws of Axos, Features don't quite pull it off. Mutants certainly don't. Hand of Fear's okay. Invisible Enemy definitely doesn't. Underworld most certainly doesn't. And I just sort of go, did they set themselves up to fail a bit more often than they should have by just not sitting there and going, can we make this a little bit more filmable?
Well, look, let's pick up on the Mutants. I think when I'm watching that, I think the CSO is really bad. I think the cast isn't great. In fact, I've seen it said before today that Jeffrey Palmer's the best thing in it, and he's dead before the first episode's over.
Yep.
So, you know, and yeah, I think Bob and Dave are thinking caterpillars turning into butterflies, you know, something ugly turning into something beautiful. And that's their big idea here. It just doesn't translate. It's one of those stories you hear about and think, oh, I'll give this a go. It can't be that bad. And a few episodes in, and with a few more to go, you realise, yeah, maybe it's not so great. But is that on them? I know they wrote it, but they didn't do the CSO. They didn't cast the thing. They didn't direct it. You know, there's a lot that goes into making the Mutants dull. Would it be better if it was made on a new budget with a great cast today?
Yeah, I think that's a very good example for the defence. But let me
yes.
Let me give you the Armageddon Factor, where
okay.
My first experience of the Armageddon Factor, I'm fairly sure, was the Target book.
Sure.
I definitely saw a repeat of it here, I think about 88, but I reckon I had the Target book read to me a couple of years earlier. And in that, one of the big memories I have is that idea of a third planet between Atrios and Zeos that is basically blocking the view of each planet from the other. And the novel really talks about this sort of proper craggy planetoid that is a planet of evil. And in the script, they keep referring to this planet of evil. In the TV show, it's 4 eggs sort of stuck to a very flimsy frame. It's terrible, it's woeful, and it certainly never gives that impression of, oh, this thing could block your view of Zeos from Atrios. It never delivers that. Now, credit to them for having that really cool idea, which as a kid in the novel fired my imagination. But should they have sat there and gone, you know what, maybe the BBC budget can't stretch to 3 whole planets, let's make it 2. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, if you want a 1970s example of, oh my God, the money's run out at the end of the season, which is something we talk about a lot on the podcast when we're doing season reviews, I think this is a great one to throw on and study, because I think the Armageddon Factor is the poster child for, oh my God, the money's run out at the end of the season. So even if they were coming up with a big idea, and as you say, when you read the Target novel, just the pure distilled idea is so good. Could it have even been better if it wasn't being filmed last at the end of this big season and there just was a bit more money, perhaps?
Yeah, look, I think that's right, but to expand this idea a little bit further, when they write the Sontaran experiment, now I don't know what the brief was, but clearly they were told 2 parts, presumably they were told all on location and 1, 2, 3 guest actors. They were clearly told this is the budget saver of the season. I'm not saying it's necessarily their best script, but I think a number of people would say it's their best script. It's certainly a contender for their best script. And when they just write that tighter, smaller, in every sense, story, they write it really effectively. So occasionally, maybe their ambition, whilst commendable, did let them down. Maybe they should have gone a bit smaller, a bit often, because they're clearly very good at it.
Yeah, and yet the Sontaran experiment gets overlooked, I think, a little too much, which I find extraordinary because, 2-parters are so rare and they're easy to watch. It should stand out for those reasons alone. And it's a fun enough runabout. I mean, I've compared it to a fan film we made back in the late 80s in our local club in terms of, a simple plot just running around a location and resolving something.
For sure.
But you've got to not really think about things too hard at the same time when you watch that. Like, why do they only send 1 Sontaran? Why are they experimenting on humans when the Earth is hardly jam-packed with humans anymore anyway? You sort of pick at it and it's a bit flimsy at the same time. So I have a strange relationship with the Sontaran experiment. I think it should be better regarded, yet I don't think it's maybe as good as you're suggesting, if you're suggesting it's nice and tight and could be one of their best episodes, because I don't think it is.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I'll therefore give you the Hand of Fear,
okay,
which I think is a bit all over the shop for the first 2.5 episodes. But when they get to the TARDIS and it's just the Doctor, Sarah, and Eldrad for an episode and a half, I think that's, again, some of their really best work, because you get a bit more time with that character and you get things brought down tenser. You get the sort of the claustrophobic walk through the caves of Castria, and then the twist with Eldrad and Rokon and all the rest of that. Rokon! So, again, would I want them to not be as ambitious? Absolutely not, because that is clearly their signature, and it's great that they have that in them. But I will throw into the conversation that maybe their best work is their small-scale work.
Well, look, to back that up, I'm forever grateful that the Hand of Fear didn't have the Brigadier flying his spaceship into another spaceship to stop it crashing into Earth, which was something that was originally tossed around as an idea to happen in the Hand of Fear. Thank goodness for Small Mercies. That's the kind of big ideas I think they were having when it comes to stuff like Hand of Fear. Dave, I think a lot of people think of Hand of Fear and just think, oh, well, it's goodbye to Sarah Jane, and remember it for that reason alone. But yes, there are some really good episodes in there. I think Liz Sladen is great in that. I think she's a fabulous baddie, if I can say that. Baddie?
Yeah, I think so. Antagonist, maybe.
Antagonist, yeah, that's a better way to put it. I think it's a really neat story. The final episode might not land quite as well as it could. Maybe that colours people's ideas about the whole story. But I think it's pretty solid. And like I say, there were some bigger ideas kicking around than actually made it to screen.
Yeah, I'm actually the opposite to you. I think that it gets better as it goes along. I think that,
okay.
Although it has that great opening with the whole entire bloody quarry exploding, like that's a great opening. I think it does get a little bit messy from there. Yes, Liz Sladen is great, but I do think that once it becomes the Dr. Seer and Eldrad, that's the best stuff in there, which I think is interesting.
Well, look, let's change tack and talk Three Doctors then, which I think is great. It's fun. It was something new for the show. I think people who have come along in later generations don't really appreciate it for what it is. You know, even I came along into fandom at a time where there were the 5 Doctors and the 2 Doctors as well. They were all things. So the 3 Doctors, to me, has always just been something in that style. But to someone in the early 70s, this would have been a real wow moment. All the Doctors on screen? Like, oh my God, fabulous.
Yeah, I think that the Three Doctors is a wonderful example of the best of their writing. And I think particularly the way they were able to write under pressure, because they were told initially you've got the 3 Doctors, and then they're told you can't have William Hartnell, then okay, you can have him but only on the TV screen for a couple of minutes every episode. Which companions were going to be in it was sort of switched around, and who was going where was switched around regularly. So they had to be able to adjust their script quite a lot on a regular basis. And given that they do that, and still the dialogue between the Doctors is, I think, better than anything in the 5 Doctors, the 2 Doctors, or indeed the however many Doctors were in, what's it called? Day of the Doctor. I think there's some really good sparkling dialogue in there. There's some great stuff with the Brigadier. I think it's really good. Interestingly, though, as well, you mentioned before how sometimes they're not ambitious ideas, but they're bonkers ideas.
Yeah.
Do get knocked back. The fact that they envisaged Omega as being the character Ohm, and he was called Ohm because that's the word who upside down, is clearly a bonkers idea that Terrence Dix quite rightly said, no, we're not doing that. And then they've gone, oh, Omega? Yep, fine, we'll do that. That's again that thing. But again, you read the Target book, and Omega lives in this sort of what's left of this great garden. And the singularity is this great column of fire and smoke that goes up into a cathedral-like ceiling. And okay, it's filmed and it's a quarry with some very plastic sets and a pissy little bit of smoke going up a couple of metres.
Yeah.
Is that their fault? No. And I think that the Three Doctors is a story that rises above the limitations of the budget, because the ideas are so good, the dialogue's so good, the characters are so good. Whereas I think The Invisible Enemy falls down because the big idea that they can't do on screen is the whole premise of the story. The whole premise of The Invisible Enemy is that we're going to go inside the Doctor's bloodstream or inside his brain. And the moment that just can't be realised on screen, the whole story falls in a heap. Whereas, okay, so the filming locations are quarry. Well, so is 80% of Doctor Who. Who cares? That's not fundamental to this story. The 3 Doctors and Omega is fundamental to that story. So when the visuals fall down, who cares? But if you make the story about the visuals and that falls down, that's a problem.
Yeah, well, The Invisible Enemy is a good example of something else as well, which is when we say they're having these big ideas and throwing them at the wall and seeing what sticks. They invent K9, but it's not with the idea that he's going to be a companion. They just invent K9 as a little offsider for the Professor. Professor Marius, isn't it, in that?
Yes, Professor Marius.
Yeah. And there's absolutely no thought that this is going to be a companion. And then the production team are like, oh, well, look, we could do this. We could make it a companion, blah, blah, blah. I find that extraordinary, that they were having such big ideas that even something like K9, which is rooted in Doctor Who history and lore, and loads of people love K9 and all this. I don't particularly, but I know loads of people do. And it's just an accident more than anything.
Yes, it is a bit of serendipity. You're right there, Bob. But I also think that K9 encapsulates one of the really good things about Bob Baker and Dave Martin, which is that they got the brief. They knew who they were writing Doctor Who for. They were writing it for the family audience, but particularly the legendary Robert Holmes smart teenager. You know, it's a kid show, but for the kid who is always putting his hand up in class to ask another question. And they got that brief, and I think that K9 absolutely nails that. It's a show that's for, we all hate to say it, but it's a show for kids that adults can also enjoy. But they never forget that audience. I think K9 absolutely encapsulates that.
Yeah. After Invisible Enemy, of course, there's Underworld, so it's worth talking about because I feel Underworld is frustrating because I think, and this will be controversial for some people out there, I think the first episode is all right. And I don't really know why people bag it. Unless they're lumping it in with the later episodes. I think that's a lazy thing to do. But they might be lumping it in as one whole and saying, well, the whole thing is terrible. But I think the first episode is demonstrably better than what comes after it. I mean, what comes after it is that CSO nightmare and awful costumes. The Doctor and Leela even feel off. But again, that's not on the writers, so although they're attached to a stinker, I don't think it's on them. I think what they present, and again, a big idea, these people have got the power of regeneration from the Time Lords, and then we're into a Greek myth analogy, and give me a bigger idea than that. There aren't many out there. It's a huge idea, Dave. I find Underworld quite good, at least in episode 1.
I think Underworld is terrible, and I think that this is one where they have to take a certain amount of the blame.
Okay.
Absolutely the production team that, look, we all get it, out of desperation, delivered what they delivered, takes another part of the blame. But as we discussed when we dived into season 15, I think that this is, by some measure, their weakest script. It's full of lots of very bland characters with sort of terrible one-syllable sci-fi names, Trog, Brog, Hog, or whatever. It's got these sort of ideas that sort of happen and they're not really developed. Yes, it's sort of very clever. And we can call a spaceship the P7E. Get it? Persephone? Like, once you've sort of got over, that's very clever, there's not a lot to it. It's got lots of throwaway ideas. The two giant condom dudes that you're just like, what are they meant to be? Like, we've evolved past, what?
Yeah.
Who are you? What are you? And now you're just a couple of robots with really bad heads. I just think the dialogue there just fails to spark at all. I think they are tired at this point. I think that they are rushed at this point, and it's a weak piece of work that then is completely and utterly shattered by woeful production as well.
Yeah. Oh, look, that's fair, and in no way am I defending the episodes after episode 1. It's episode 1 that captures my imagination, and I think the production isn't too bad on it.
No, fair enough. You're more positive on that than I am, Bob. Something that I wanted to mention here that I really noticed as well is, again, they get the brief about Doctor Who in terms of writing adventures in time and space. And I was going through looking for messaging, politics, that sort of thing, and there's not a lot of it in there. I mean, when it comes to political satire, you've got the character of Chin, who is, if anything, more comic relief than he is political satire. Yes, you've got the Doctor sort of talking about ensuring that we're citizens of the world and a global society and going against the sort of England for the English stuff, and the Mutants is clearly, got a message that says apartheid is bad. It's like, well, okay, that's not, that's a correct message, but is it the most subtle and, probing sort of thought out there? It's
not really profound.
It's not really profound. Maybe the Sontaran experiment, he's saying torture's bad, or maybe that's just a coincidence. And I'm not having a go at them for that, to be very clear. We all know that there are some great Doctor Who stories where messaging and politics can be woven in, but it must serve the plot, and they certainly never let that stuff get in the way. Let's go, what's going to keep everybody entertained for 25 minutes on a Saturday night, and let's get on with it. And I think that is not a bad thing for this time.
Yeah, yep, concur with that.
A couple of general points to go through here, Bob.
You're enjoying saying that, I think.
I am. I grew up with my father wanted to drop the word Bob whenever he had an excuse to, because he was a big Blackadder fan, so I am enjoying it. I did find when it comes to their writing, they lean into archetypes a lot more than characters. It's often, he's the professor, he's the poacher, he's the doctor, he's the marshal. I don't think that any of those sort of characters have a particularly strong personality or character. There are exceptions. Eldrad, I think, is very well written. A couple of the characters in Three Doctors are very well written. But generally, they're not really into developing the characters all that well.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and possibly the result of them not being professional writers and literally just tossing 1-2 page ideas around until they started being commissioned for scripts, and then just writing scripts, almost getting stuff up on screen as soon as they wrote it. You know, they didn't spend 5 years or 10 years slogging away doing very menial stuff. They were commissioned to write Doctor Who straight away, you know, and they maybe just didn't have the experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. It's a very good point. And similar to that, they also don't fall onto the trap of leaning into baddies all that often. The Claws of Axos doesn't really have a baddie. Axos has ill intent towards us, but only because that's its nutrition cycle.
Yeah.
The Mutants has the Marshal. He's clearly a baddie, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on, and it turns out the Mutts actually aren't bad people after all. The Three Doctors has Omega, who's misunderstood. Yep, there's a monster in Sontaran experiment. The Hand of Fear, Eldrad. Is he a baddie? Is she a baddie? Yes, but are they also coming from a particular place? Yes, they are. The virus in the Invisible Enemy definitely isn't a baddie. It's just a virus, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, interestingly, in their writing, again, they don't lean on, well, here's my big bad of the week, here's my monster of the week. They do actually have some slightly more interesting protagonists and antagonists. So having said that they don't have very good characters, I do think that they fall outside the cliches of the baddies every week.
Yeah, I agree with that too. It's really interesting when you put it like that, but it's perfectly true, yeah.
And the final thing I wanted to observe before I know you've got a couple of points to sort of take us into our top twos and bottom twos is, again, just looking at the producers that they worked under. Now, I'm not saying Sontaran Experiment and Hand of Fear are their top two stories. I'm absolutely not saying that. But I'm saying I think a lot of fans would have those as contenders of their better two stories.
Yep.
And the fact that they were both produced by Philip Hinchcliffe, who was a very good producer, had a very good budget at the time, may not be coincidence. Maybe when their scripts do have a little bit more money sloshing around and a producer like Philip Hinchcliffe, they do rise a bit further.
I don't think it can be an accident, put it that way.
No, and maybe as well having Robert Holmes as your script editor. I mean, that can't hurt your script either.
Oh, hell no. No, and they got on quite well with him as well. So I think there was a lot of collaboration and a lot of back and forth. And that's always a healthy thing too, whether you're writing scripts or just in your day-to-day work. If you get on with the people you work with, the results are always better. Yeah,
and I think you're right. I think that these were collaborations, whether it was Dix or Holmes or Reed. These are occasions where they deliver their first draft or their story brief. They come in and over a few cigarettes and maybe a pint over an afternoon, they collaborate and go, well, what if this character did this? What if we changed that to this? How would this work? And then they went away and rewrote it, rather than what would happen with other authors is sort of like, okay, this is as good as you're going to get it. Leave it with me and I'll get out the typewriter and I'll start rewriting this myself.
Yeah, precisely. Now, I found it quite interesting, Dave, to think about when they split, because obviously Bob went on to write another story solo after the partnership split up. And I think, well, what did split the partnership up? You know, it was sort of half remembered. And I actually found a quote from Bob. And Bob said that Dave said, look, I don't want to go on doing this. I want to write novels. And Bob says, I thought, dark clouds looming up for me. What's it going to be like writing on my own? I've never done that. And when it came to it, I wished him the best. He wished me the best. And I went towards the production side of things more, script editing and eventually producing at HTV. And he went off and wrote novels. He wrote 4 detective novels, police detective novels that sold reasonably well, I think. But he was a lot happier doing that, being alone in his room and smoking.
Yeah, fair enough. I never got the sense that there was a big falling out.
No, that's right.
They just decided they wanted to do different things after, a decade working together.
Yeah, Yeah. Again, to go back to that episode we recorded when you were in Sydney, we were talking about, there's a question, what would stop you reviewing new Doctor Who episodes? And it's like, well, if one of us decided not to do it, the other would, say, well, okay. And that would be that, And I think that agreeable sort of nature we have here on the podcast is the sort of agreeable nature I see between these two. They didn't have a big bust up. It was quite amicable. And as I said, Bob went on to write another Doctor Who story on his own.
Yes, The Nightmare of Eden, which doesn't fall in the Bob and Dave category, but certainly has ambition and certainly has some interesting characters.
Yeah. I think a lot of people appreciate it for what it's trying to do, but maybe just not succeeding.
Yeah, if ever there was a case of a very good idea and script just being destroyed by acting and special effects and director and a lot of things, it's The Nightmare of Eden. Mm. Wow.
Yeah. And of course, Bob would sort of come back into the Doctor Who sphere much later with the Australian K9 series. Now, I'll say up front, I never had any interest in this. I never watched it. What I've seen of it in clips looks absolutely grim. But it's interesting when some UK fans realise you're from Australia. They're always like, oh, hey, how about that K9 show? What did you think of that? As if it was some sort of cultural phenomenon here. And we all must have watched it because, it's Australian. So, of course, we must have watched it. I always feel like I'm pricking their bubble when I'm like, it was a nothing sort of show here as far as I can remember. I don't know anyone who watched it. I don't remember it being spoken about or advertised. And I certainly didn't watch it. The end.
No, I don't remember it being on here at all, but it would have been advertised on a channel that I probably wasn't watching at a time slot that I certainly wasn't watching. So I didn't see it go out, but I have seen a couple of them just, online here and there. And again, I think I can say that when those were produced, they understood the brief. They are made for kids, not just young adults and families. It is a kid show made for kids, and I think that it does that perfectly adequately. I suspect if I had been 6 when I saw that, I would have bloody loved it.
Oh, really?
But I wasn't 6 when I watched it. I was 30-something. And it was like, okay, look, this is interesting. And, oh, look, it's got that actor from Please Like Me. But no, that was as far as I went. I do need to mention as well, Bob, that Dave Martin did write the Make Your Own Adventure book, Search for the Doctor, which has the return of that classic character that we all wanted to see more of, Drax.
Yes.
With, if memory serves, a TARDIS disguised as a Cadillac or something.
Oh, you're stretching my memory now, but it's on my shelf over there. Yep.
Yes. All I remember is K9 Mark III coming on and being activated and it matching the K9 and Company thing. But Dave Martin did come back and write a Make Your Own Adventure book that I did have as a kid, and he's on the shelf somewhere.
Speaking of K9 and Company, in that Mythmakers interview, I don't think they were best pleased with K9 and Company.
I think they were actually quite proprietal about their work. They were quite offended when Omega was used without their permission in the Ark of Infinity. And when the BBC said, oh, whoops, we're really sorry, here's your check, they said, well, hang on. It's not just about the money, that's our character. And so I think there was a certain pride in their work as well, which is really good.
Yeah, it's good to know.
So, Rob, before we do our conclusion, we do this whenever we have our writers, and the Mark Gatiss one was particularly controversial. Out of the 8 stories that they wrote, what are your top 2 and what are your bottom 2? Let's start with your top 2, Rob.
I'd be surprised if we don't snap here at least once, if not twice.
Yep.
For me, it's the 3 Doctors and the Hand of Fear.
One snap.
Okay.
For me, it's the 3 Doctors and the Sontaran Experiment.
There you go.
Bottom 2, Rob?
Again, I'd be surprised if we don't get 2 snaps. For me, it's the Mutants, and despite my defense of its first episode, it's Underworld. Yeah,
look, a double snap for me. Unfortunately, the Mutants is my least favourite Pertwee, and Underworld is my least favourite Tom Baker. So they are not stories I regard all that well. But I've got to say, as I was going through the list, those 2 did really stand out as being quite clearly below the pack. There were a number that were in contention for my top 2. And even something like the Armageddon Factor, which, look, it's a slog, still has enough cool ideas and bits going all the way through that I'm very happy to defend it. I'm happy to defend the ambition of The Invisible Enemy, even if the production doesn't quite come off. Claws of Axos, some good ideas, some great dialogue for the Master. Some of it doesn't work. It's such a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting... We didn't talk about it, so I'll just briefly say it's an interesting idea. It's got a really cool sort of bright day-glow look. It's got the Doctor and Joe. That's a tick. It's got Unit. That's a tick. The Master's not really needed, though. And it kind of has this disastrous reputation, which I don't think it deserves. I still find it quite watchable. I don't sit there thinking, oh, gosh, this is just the worst thing I've ever seen. I think it's a better story than the production values suggest, that one.
Yeah, look, I think in that first couple of seasons of the Pertwee era, it is the weaker one, but that's against two solid standout, back-to-back, just walls chocked with classics stories. It's got some really good ideas. It's got some really good visuals, as you say. I do think it's got some great dialogue. All the, I might as well fly a second-hand gas stove. And do we have any other options? Well, the usual precautions against nuclear fallout, sticky tape on the windows, that sort of thing. It's got some quite sparkling dialogue in there. And I think it holds together well, but it does, I think, have too much ambition for what it wants to do. And remember, it was pitched as a 7-parter.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
So it maybe just doesn't have enough room to breathe.
Yeah, I agree.
Which I think is sort of is a good summary and takes me to my conclusion, which is nothing earth-shattering. I think that they are definitely solid writers. I think they definitely have a style. They should be commended for their ambition. They should be commended for some really memorable ideas. Do they sometimes stretch the production further than it can cope? Absolutely. And when that completely falls on its ass, it really falls on its ass. But with maybe one exception, I would happily put all of these on and watch them. I mean, the Mutants, not that often. Underworld, look, if I'm not watching it for the podcast, I'm not watching it again. Yeah. There's some really good, enjoyable ones. And 3 Doctors, Sontaran Experiment, Hand of Fear, I can chuck them all on and really love them. Invisible Enemy, in the right mood, I can love that. They've written more good Doctor Who than a lot of people.
Yeah, and for mine, that's just it. I think they're underrated. It's the first word that comes into my head, particularly when you consider, again, they're among the most prolific classic era writers, yet people don't talk about them half as much as other guys who did the same amount of work or less. And it's not even like they were a flash in the pan. They were around for the best part of a decade, writing across the 2 Doctors that they wrote for, a bunch of different companions, and I think their hit-miss rate is about 50-50. And across that number of stories, I think they deserve better than they get from fandom. I think they're a bit forgotten. And I know as soon as I say that, people listening will take that to the nth degree and think I'm saying that no one remembers them. That's not what I'm saying. They're remembered, particularly in discussions about K9. They will come up. I just don't think they're remembered maybe enough.
I don't think they're remembered in proportion to what they did for the show.
That's the way to put it, yes.
I think that's a very good summary. So that was Bob and Dave do Bob and Dave. As always, write in and let us know what you thought about our topic and our discussion. We'd love to hear from you. And in fact, we have heard from a number of listeners. So would you like to kick us off